Hey guys, good afternoon or good morning, still, I guess. I wanted to both to sort of prepare a little bit, but also to make sure that something is recorded, get down a basic explanation of Krehbiel and the gridlock interval so that we don't have to spend as much time on this in discussion today, but so that you guys still have something to refer to as you study. Um, I'm going to go ahead and record this. If you guys have any issues with the recording or if anything else goes wonky, just let me know. My hope is that this is going to be a nice blend of both seeing me on video and seeing the slides, but let me know. Long story short, Krehbiel is a very big deal in basically what is understood as legislative politics. Krehbiel is basically writing about legislative productivity. When does Congress pass bills? When does Congress not pass bills? Can we come up with kind of a theoretical or a structural understanding of how Congress works or doesn't work? That doesn't depend on some of these existing weaker explanations like divided government and some of the other stuff that you guys saw in lecture. Okay. Um, um, One thing that I can spend a little bit more time doing in this recording, but that I really won't be doing very much in discussion, um, is talking through the rules. I think the professor may have gone through this a little bit quickly and sort of assumed that you understood it from the reading. And so just in case that wasn't clear, I wanted to highlight some of the terms, the assumptions, and the rules that are central to Krehbiel. So what are those things? First and foremost, we're talking about a legislature, and I think most of the time when people talk about Krehbiel, they're thinking about the Senate, right? Because the Senate already has, an existing filibuster rule that it takes two-thirds of the Senate, or rather 60 votes in the Senate to end debate on a given bill. People tend to think about the Senate when they think about Krehbiel. So that's the first thing to note is that we're talking about legislatures. The second is that when we talk about the status quo, we're talking about the policy that's currently in place. I think in a lot of the examples that we got in lecture, that was the minimum wage. So it's just whatever the minimum wage currently is. But you can imagine there being a status quo for any given policy issue. It's just whatever the policy is at present date at the moment. The thing that's being proposed, the sort of alternative, if you want to think about it that way, is called a bill, and we tend to think about the bill as being proposed by the median senator. The kind of main mechanics of this setup are that the median senator is proposing a bill and effectively trying to see what he or she can get away with, right? Can they basically get the requisite number of senators to vote in favor of the bill? Can they get the president to sign the bill, and in so doing move policy? So that's kind of term number two. Um, and I'm just down here in assumptions for anybody following along. The third and still pretty important assumption to keep in mind is that each senator is voting just on this issue sincerely. So they're not keeping in mind like how might other people vote based on my vote, anything like that. They're just comparing the bill that's being proposed to the status quo, saying, am I better off under the newly proposed bill or not? Voting for the newly proposed bill if they're better off. And in cases of a tie, so in cases where they're equally, as good or as bad off under the newly proposed bill and the status quo, they break the tie is broken in favor of the newly proposed bill. It could have gone the other way, but just for the purposes of convention, that's how it goes in this class. Um, um, okay, one other thing to keep in mind too is that I'm sure you guys understand that there are kind of different senators on this single dimension of a policy issue. Let's say the minimum wage. Each of those senators is a voter, has the ability to vote. But there are kind of two. There are three, I guess, technically special pivots or special voters that we have in mind. The first is the median, who is of course in the middle. If we have five senators, it's kind of third from the left, third from the right. But there are also two other important pivots. One is the presidential veto pivot. that can unilaterally reject any bill, right? So whatever bill is proposed, the presidential pivot can even if it passes, can strike down that bill. And then what we sort of introduce also in the examples and exercises from lecture 9, so the first of the Krehbiel exercises, we introduced in class this idea that you might need a supermajority to pass bills. So not just 3 out of 5 senators to go from the status quo to the new bill, but you actually need now 4 out of 5, right? And so in the real Senate, this is 60 votes. In our example, this is going to be 4 out of 5. Okay. And those are usually called the pivots, is the median voter, the presidential veto, and the supermajority senator. One thing I wanted to do super quickly was to just sort of motivate this a little bit with some real life examples by calling out who some of these people are. And so I think it gets tricky when you start thinking about the filibuster pivot, who is the 60th sort of, senator, who is the 60th vote. Some of that stuff can get pretty tricky. But I think it's relatively straightforward to think about the median. And so what I've done here is on the left side, I've grabbed plots from a website called VoteView that all it does is it plots people on 2 dimensions of politics. And so I'm actually going to simplify that even further down and just call your attention to the first dimension, which is captured on the x-axis, right? And what this axis is doing is it's plotting senators from the most liberal over here on the left to the most conservative over here on the right. And so if you want to think about Bernie Sanders being over here on the left, you can think of somebody like Mike Lee from Utah as being here on the far right, or Tommy Tuberville from Alabama, right? Those are 2 folks that would be kind of on the left and the right, respectively. Who we are interested in are the folks that are right here in the middle, because they are the median. They are the 51st, right, senator who, if a bill is proposed, they are the one to take it from a dead tie, half in support, half opposed, to actually passing, right? They're the sort of 50% plus 1 vote that can take a bill from being a dead tie to actually passing. And so in the current Congress, usually people think about this as Susan Collins, who's this sort of red dot over here, or as Joe Manchin, who's this blue dot here. And just to underscore this point, I didn't do anything AI or wonky with this picture. Literally, Susan Collins has a very prominent photo of her wearing a red jacket and a very prominent photo of her wearing a blue jacket, which I think just perfectly underscores this idea of being a pivot, right? Of being a median is you're relatively in the middle, but you're also decisive. And so sometimes you'll vote with one party, basically with one half of the Senate, and sometimes you'll vote with the other half. So I just thought it was sort of cool and helpful of Susan Collins to sort of make my point for me with her jacket choices. Joe Manchin, of course, is now retiring, but he's pictured over here again. This blue dot here, who we tend to think of as playing this sort of important median type role in the Senate. Okay. So I wanted to pause and highlight the definitions that the professor sort of lays out in lecture, and the kind of what I think is the most effective summary of the Krehbiel gridlock interval that we got in class. So let's just sort of go through that word for word as it came up in lecture. The first thing is just that when the median senator sets policy, there is no gridlock, right? So when there is no presidential veto, when there is no supermajority filibuster pivot, if the median senator is setting policy, policy is always going to be what that median senator wants. There is no gridlock, right? When we introduce the president as a veto, so when the president can veto, there exists gridlock. Gridlock occurs if the current policy is between the ideal of the median and the ideal point of the presidential veto. Okay, and so we'll look through this when we talk about specific examples in a little bit, but that is just the simple definition of where that gridlock interval occurs. Is it's going to be between the ideal point of the median senator and the ideal point of the presidential veto. If the policy status quo, if the existing policy is anywhere between those ideal points, then we get gridlock. We don't get policy change, right? Okay. And so last but not least, when we introduce two pivots, so not just the presidential veto, but the super majority pivot as well, when the president can veto and the 60-vote supermajority is needed, or rather, when a 60-vote supermajority is needed, we get gridlock if the current policy, if the status quo, is between that supermajority pivot's ideal point and again the president's ideal point. So now it's not the median and the presidential veto, but it's the supermajority or the filibuster pivot and the presidential veto. And so you'll see this in action in a little bit, but I just want to make sure that these definitions are laid out explicitly, because this is what you can come back to once you've gone through the examples and have seen this in action. You can come back to these definitions as your sort of fundamental definition. Okay. So this is something that we're going to be doing in class. I can skip over it for now. Let's go to the examples. So these are all pulled, I think, for the most part, from the lecture 9 activity. I think maybe a few will come from the lecture 10 in class activity. But let's go ahead and jump in. So what do we see here? Remembering that each of the blue dots is a senator, and that the golden star in the middle here is the status quo, is the existing policy. What happens when the status quo is 11 and we have no presidential veto and we have supermajority pivot? Well, it's actually quite simple. Is the median voter who's at 10, who prefers a $10 minimum wage, is going to propose a bill at $10 and is herself, going to vote for that bill. And we'll also, in proposing a $10 minimum wage, we'll make the $8 and the $4 senators better off. They will vote in favor of the new bill to move the minimum wage from 11 to 10. And so policy will jump from $11 to $10. Okay, we will end up with a $10 minimum wage. In other words, we will end up with the median senator's minimum wage, and the answer is just captured over here. So in all these examples, I'm not hiding anything. The answer will always be right here. In the same way, we can go through the exercise through this second exercise. So what happens to policy when we have an $18 minimum wage as the status quo, and we introduce a presidential veto, which is captured by this green triangle here, at $14. Okay, so we have an $18 status quo minimum wage. We have a presidential veto, a president basically who has the power to veto, who prefers a $14 minimum wage. What happens here? Well, the process is going to be pretty similar. We're going to start by looking at the median senator and ask ourselves, what is this person going to do? And so that part's staying the same. The only part that's changing a little bit is that we have to keep in mind this presidential veto now too. Okay, so starting with the $10 minimum wage median senator, we ask ourselves, what does this person want with the minimum wage? Well, they're pretty far from the 18. They're pretty far over here to the left, which means they want a lower minimum wage. And so they're probably going to propose something that's going to take the minimum wage from $18 and take it to the left. Okay, how far can they go? Well, how far do they want to go? They probably want to get it to 10. And so let's ask ourselves, can they get a $10 minimum wage? Let's say they propose the $10 minimum wage. Well, the $8 senator is gonna prefer that. They're gonna vote for that. The $4 senator is gonna prefer that as well. They're gonna vote for that as well. The $10 senator obviously is proposing their exact ideal preferred outcome, so they're gonna vote in favor of that bill as well. But we have to ask ourselves, we have to go to the sort of next level, to this next check, which is does the president veto or not this newly proposed bill? And the way that we can study this, can understand this, is by looking at the fact that the $14 presidential pivot here is equally distant from the $18 status quo and the $10 newly proposed bill. Right, they're $4 away from both of these policies. That means that they're equidistant, or they're indifferent between these two outcomes. And because we are assuming that ties break in the direction of the newly proposed bill, they're not going to have an issue with the $10 minimum wage, even though maybe they would prefer a $12 minimum wage. They're still fine with the $10 minimum wage. Okay, and so they're not going to veto. They're not going to reject the newly proposed bill. Okay, so that's just the first couple examples. Um, um, in this example, we have basically the same framework. We have 5 voting senators. We have the presidential veto, that's represented by the green triangle. We have not yet introduced the supermajority threshold, where a bill needs 4 votes instead of just the simple majority 3 votes. So we're still in the world where a bill only needs 3 votes to pass. But we have a different status quo. So whereas over here in the previous example with the same setup, we looked at a case where the minimum wage was pretty extreme, was $18 and pretty high. We're now looking at a status quo policy that's a little more moderate, that's a little more close to the median. And so we ask ourselves what happens with this policy. And I want to touch on 2 things. The first is just the answer to the solution, which is going to be $11 that we can understand by, again, checking in with the median, right? Checking in with the median and the presidential veto. So how do we do this? The status quo is $11. Okay, so that's the existing policy. We ask ourselves, does the $10 median senator propose a new bill? Yes, they do. They propose a $10 minimum wage, which is their ideal point. And so what happens? Okay, so the $10 median senator is going to vote for the policy. The $8 minimum wage senator is going to vote for the policy. The $4 minimum wage senator is going to vote for the policy. So that's 3 votes in favor. We don't have a supermajority requirement yet, so we're all good. Why doesn't the policy move to the median senator's ideal point? The answer is simply because it's moving away from the presidential veto. So the president is going to look at the $10 proposal, compare it to the 11, and say, I don't want that. You're moving away from my preferred policy. You're making me worse off. I'm not going to vote in favor of that. And so even though moving from 11 to 10 passes with the median and with the 2 other people that you need to pass the bill, it's going to be rejected by the presidential veto. So that's the first thing I wanted to cover, is just the solution. The second thing is to take note of the fact that we could have answered this by saying that the status quo will remain unchanged, by just observing the simple fact that the status quo is between the median senator and the presidential veto. That is the gridlock interval. In the version of this model where there is no supermajority requirement, right, which I've flagged up here, in that version of the world, the gridlock interval exists between the $10 wage and the $14 wage, right? Which is, of course, what the second part of the definitions that I talked about says right here, right? When the president can veto, when there is a green triangle, gridlock occurs if the current policy is between the median's ideal and the president's ideal. Well, that's exactly what $11 is. It's between the median's ideal and the president's ideal. Okay. So now what I want to do is to show you that we can compare the example that we just talked about, where the $11 policy remains unchanged. We can compare this scenario to the scenario that we talked about at the very beginning, right? Which is I pulled in right here as well. So the same example that we talked about at the very beginning, I've got right here. Okay. In both cases, right, the status quo is $11. The minimum wage is $11. All the senators have the same preferences. But in this example, the policy that we end up with is $11, is the status quo. And in the second example, the policy that we end up with is $10, is the median's ideal point. A natural question is to ask, why under these sort of situations in which the status quo is the same, do we end up with different policies? And the answer the answer that we get is that we added 2 pivots. So we added this supermajority pivot. I'm now talking about the case in which we have a supermajority requirement, and we also added the presidential pivot here. Really, this presidential pivot is the main one doing the work. We actually don't even need the supermajority pivot in this case, because the status quo is already between the median senator's preferred ideal point and the presidential veto. Even if we didn't have this supermajority, $11 would still fail to move from the status quo to the median's preferred. Okay, so the simple takeaway is just that introducing the presidential pivot is what prevents the median's ideal point from being reached in the case when there's an $11 minimum wage. Okay. And so moving now to the case where we are saying that there's a supermajority requirement, that rather than just 3 votes to pass a policy, you need 4. Okay, so in this supermajority version of the world, we can define the gridlock interval now as, instead of being between the median senator's ideal point and the presidential veto ideal point, instead the gridlock interval is going to be between the supermajority pivot, right? The person that's going to be the 4th vote in favor of a bill, and again the presidential veto's ideal point, right? So we can visually represent the gridlock interval as being between 8 and 14 here, as being between the filibuster or supermajority pivot and the presidential pivot, right? This is the visual representation of that gridlock interval. And the verbal definition that goes with this is just the third part of what I covered a couple slides ago, right? When the president can veto and a 60-vote supermajority or a filibuster pivot is needed, gridlock occurs if the current policy is between the 60th senator's ideal point and the president's ideal point. And so instead of 60, in this case, we have 4, right? So it's whenever the filibuster pivot, or whenever the status quo is between the filibuster pivot and the president's ideal point, which, yeah, sorry, is actually represented up here, and is visualized in this gridlock interval here, right? So to just say all of that one more time, if a policy is proposed here in the gridlock interval, it will fail. It will not be passed, and policy will not move to that new proposed bill at the expense of the status quo. Okay. And so we can see that gridlock interval in action. We can actually see it working, right? And I just want to emphasize how just visually, or how effective the visual understanding, the graphical understanding of the gridlock interval is, right? So redefining and remembering the gridlock interval is between the supermajority voter and the presidential pivot. We can see that a minimum wage that a minimum wage status quo that's outside the interval, for example, 6 or 7 will move, right? So the minimum wage will move from 6 to 10 in the first case, and from 7 to 9 in the second case. We don't see gridlock, right? We see policy change, represented by the green checks here. So policy change happens when the status quo is outside the gridlock interval. But as soon as the status quo is within the gridlock interval, so as soon as the status quo is at $8, let's say, or $9, right, 2 points that are within these sort of orange brackets here, all of a sudden we get gridlock, right? All of a sudden, represented by these sort of red X's here, we see that we do not move the policy towards the median. Okay, it doesn't have to be the case. It doesn't have to be that policy change moves exactly to the median, or rather, we don't have to see policy move exactly to the median to call it policy change. It just has to move towards the median. But we don't even get that in these 2 cases here, right? As soon as the status quo is within the gridlock interval, the status quo dominates. The status quo does not change. So the quick summary here is just that you can go through each policy one by one and ask yourself, what does the median voter want? What does the presidential pivot want? And do all of those steps that we've been doing up to this point. In fact, to understand exactly where the policy ends up, when the status quo is outside the gridlock interval, you have to do that. But to just answer the basic question of whether policy change occurs or not, all you need to know is the status quo in the gridlock interval or not. That is sufficient to tell you whether policy change happens. Okay. And so getting to the end here, and let me just move this over a little bit. We saw in class this graph, and let me show you the right side up version of it really quickly here. I skipped over it because we're going to be doing this in class. So this right here is the is a graphical representation of both what happens to policy under different existing status quo policies, but it's also a graphical representation of the gridlock interval. So the way to read this is as follows: when the current minimum wage is $4, the new minimum wage that we end up with once the bill is proposed and we do all the voting, right? We start at $4, but we end up at $10 for our minimum wage. If the existing status quo minimum wage is 6, we once again end up at 10. But when the existing minimum wage is 8, we end up at 8. When the existing minimum wage is 10, we end up at 10. When the existing minimum wage is 12, we end up with 12. When the existing minimum wage is 14, we end up at 14, etc. Right? You can sort of read this across the graph. So again, this is just plotting what policies we end up with given existing minimum wage policies. And to just connect that graph to the examples that we were talking about here, right? The examples that showed us that when the status quo is outside the gridlock interval, there's policy change. And when the status quo is within the gridlock interval, there is not policy change. We can connect those examples to the graph that I just showed you, right? Which is to say that we can look, let me move this just one more time. We can look at the status quo in the example and say, okay, well, that was $6. Where did we end up? $10. $10 here on the graph. Okay, great. Next policy, $7 is right here between 6 and 8, $7. When we are at 7, we move up following bill proposals and voting and all that. We end up at 9. Okay, great. When the proposed policy is $8 right here on the x-axis, which I've flipped, of course, the resulting policy is now $8, so we're down here, etc. Right? You can plot these, you can map these examples to just a transposed version of that graph. So hopefully in your head that kind of connects this, like, you know, looking at each senator's actions to get the policy. You can connect that to this somewhat simplified version. And so when we flip the graph back, when we transpose it back to where it was at the onset, we can see that the gridlock interval is in fact represented by the sort of middle chunk of the graph here that I've demarcated once again with orange lines and with this sort of orange shading. Okay, this is the Krehbiel gridlock interval. This is the set of status quo minimum wages represented on the x-axis. It's the set of minimum wage status quos for which policy will not change, for which even if a new bill is proposed and voting happens and the president decides whether to veto or not, even if all that stuff happens, the policy will not change. It will remain at the status quo. So that'll happen for an $8 minimum wage, a $9 minimum wage, a $10 one, an $11 one, a $12 one, and so on and so forth, right? This middle orange section is the gridlock interval. Anything outside of this gridlock interval, so the parts of the graph represented by the white space, will see policy change. And in the same way that we defined the gridlock interval here as between the supermajority pivot and the presidential pivot, right? In the same way that we understood that same definition from the text or the verbal definition here, we're going to define the gridlock interval on this graph in the exact same way. It's just the orange section occurs between the supermajority filibuster pivot and the presidential veto pivot. Exact same intuition, exact same information being conveyed here, just a bit more of a summary view. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and unshare and just close by saying that that is, you know, effectively the main information that you need to understand the Krehbiel pivot, to understand the gridlock interval, it's bounded by either the supermajority pivot and the presidential pivot in the case that there is a supermajority requirement. And if there is not a supermajority requirement, it's bounded by the median pivot and the presidential veto pivot. If there is no presidential veto pivot, if the median voter or the median senator, let's say, is the one setting policy, then that is exactly what the policy will be. There is no gridlock interval because there's no gridlock happening. Okay, so we'll talk more about this in discussion, but hopefully having this recording will be helpful as well. I'm looking forward to seeing you this afternoon, and take care.